Hello everyone, and welcome to this edition of Expert Insights webinars. I'm host Don McLean, and today's session is focused on understanding EMA Policy 70 and Health Canada PRCI transparency requirements. This webinar is presented by MMS and TrialAssure. As an award-winning data-focused CRO, MMS brings insights from our global team of highly respected data and regulatory experts across 4 continents. As a technology arm of MMS, TrialAssure is a global clinical trial disclosure and data transparency suite that helps meet the regulatory compliance goals through a flexible, scalable, and streamlined platform, supporting clinical trial registration, disclosure, data sharing, anonymization, and plain language summary activities. Here to present today is Kelly Valiant, Kavita Verma, and Megan Niner. Kelly Valiant is Director of Global Transparency Strategy and Compliance, and he's responsible for providing transparency strategy, consulting, providing technical expertise on regulatory requirements and health authority registries, assisting clients and colleagues in navigating regulations, and bringing an innovative design for transparency approach to ensure alignment across the organization. With more than 20 years of experience, Kelly was previously the global head of clinical trial disclosure and transparency at Gilead Sciences and held leadership positions at Novartis, Amgen, and Pharmacia. Kavita Verma is a senior transparency lead responsible for leading the on-time delivery of disclosure and transparency-related deliverables, with a strong understanding of regulations and guidance as they pertain to transparency. With more than 15 years of experience, Kavita was previously a senior regulatory officer at Pfizer. Megan Niner is a transparency specialist at MMS focused on public disclosures, ensuring high-quality transparency deliverables that are compliant with regulatory timelines. In addition, Megan is an accomplished biologist with a PhD in biology from the University of Toledo. Thanks to our presenters for joining us today. As a reminder, your microphones will be muted for the duration of this session, and we'll be sending out a recording following this call. And if you have any questions, please enter them in the Q&A during the presentation. We will do our best to answer as many of them as we can at the conclusion of today's session. With that, I'll turn it over to Kelly Valiant. Kelly.
Great, thanks, Don, and welcome, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to join us today for what we hope will be an informative session regarding a couple relatively recent but related clinical transparency requirements. For those of you who work in or are familiar with clinical trial disclosure and data transparency, you'll likely be familiar with a lot of the information we will be discussing today. Hopefully, though, you'll find a couple nuggets of information that you can take away from the session. For those who are new to the disclosure and transparency space, welcome. While we don't have time today to dive into the details of what we're going to be discussing today, we hope that this session will at least provide you a foundation regarding the topic, and most importantly, we hope not to overwhelm you or scare you away from transparency and the activities that all of us are so passionate about. So let's go ahead and get started. What we're going to be talking about today is understanding EMA Policy 70 as well as Health Canada PRCI. We're going to go over a brief overview of sharing clinical trial data and documents, followed by an overview of EMA Policy 70 as well as Health Canada's PRCI requirement. And then we'll be comparing Policy 70 against Health Canada and the different policies, how they're similar, how they're different. We'll also be talking about different avenues and other requirements for sharing documents and where we're going in the future, where we see we're headed. And then we'll wrap up. We'll have an opportunity for questions at the end of this session. We're going to leave about 15 minutes or so. So if you have any, please feel free to enter them, as Don said. So overall, a slow start. We all know that the time and effort, cost associated with bringing new products to market is huge. And historically, sponsors have been somewhat reticent to openly share the data and information they've worked so hard and paid so much to collect. It's understandable. The movement to be more transparent has been slow in gaining buy-in and adoption by organizations. After all, it started way back in 2008, I think, is when clinicaltrials.gov went live. And until recently, many sponsors have reluctantly ceded to sharing information in this space because they're mandated to do so by law, regulation, or requirement, or are feeling the pressure to do so by industry or the general public. Clinical trial disclosure and transparency activities have largely been viewed in the realm of compliance, with sponsors opting, many sponsors opting to share the minimal amount of information and data required in order to maintain compliance. However, we're gaining momentum. Over the last several years, we've seen unprecedented increase in focus and emphasis on transparency in the clinical development space. There's new updated disclosure and transparency laws, regulations, and guidance, two of which we'll be talking about today. There's an increased focus on looking at compliance from regulatory bodies and an increased likelihood of monetary as well as non-monetary penalties for non-compliance. There's new and updated industry guidelines, ICMJE, FUSE, Transcelerate, CDISC, to name a few. And there's increased focus and attention from advocacy groups, the academic research community, and nonprofit organizations. All of these developments are expanding the scope of what is viewed as traditional disclosure and transparency activities, beyond simply registering clinical trials on clinicaltrials.gov, or posting summary results on clinicaltrials.gov or UDRCT, and are acting as catalysts for sponsors to really step back and take a holistic look at their disclosure and transparency activities in a more comprehensive way. I don't expect you to read this, but this just gives you sort of a high-level snapshot of how much activity we've seen in this space over the last several years. At the top in blue and red, you see regulations, regulatory authorities. You see industry position statements or toolkits or standards coming into play. And then there are numerous articles that are increasing on a monthly basis regarding clinical trial disclosure and data transparency. It keeps changing and changing fast, and it's only going to grow. So we're coming into a new era of transparency. We're rapidly evolving beyond simply being a checkbox compliance activity. We're becoming a critical, central, and coordinated strategic part of a sponsor's broader clinical transparency approach. As a result of all the new regulations, requirements, sponsors really should be looking across their organizations to ensure that any information and data released to the public for products that are under development are harmonized and consistent. Today, we're going to cover relatively recent addition to the growing list of transparency activities, the mandated release of clinical information. We're going to review key elements of EMA's Policy 70 and Health Canada's PRCI, see how closely these match, and explore additional pathways for sharing clinical documents. This foundational background will hopefully set the stage for the next in this series of webinars, where we'll explore strategies for successfully preparing and implementing these new regulations. That's scheduled for the 20th of August this year. So let's take a look at Policy 70. I'm going to make an assumption that most who are attending are familiar with this space. So I'm going to go through this pretty quickly because Policy 70 has been around for a little while now. And this is the stated purpose, scope, and objectives. Of course, fostering public health, being a service to patients, ensuring that data submitted under an MAA or type 2 variation is posted, and ensuring that the data that is released is available for researchers, for the public, and for anyone else who may have an interest in looking at and reviewing this information. Core principles. Of course, when EMA Policy 70 was coming into effect, this was a primary concern of everyone involved, really, across the board. Protecting personal data and protecting IP, or commercially confidential information. These are primary tenets around the release of these clinical trial documents. Releasing protocols, releasing CSRs, releasing submission documents, summary documents, have sensitive information in them, not only about the patients and patient data, but potentially about the sponsor and their pipeline and their plans for their pipeline. So we have to be very conscious and very thoughtful in the way that we approach releasing this information. EMA Policy 70 has been a stepwise implementation. Phase 1 was adopted in 2015, became effective for all new MAAs, marketing authorization applications, from June 1st, 2015, and for type 2 variations from July 1st, 2015. As we all know, in August 2018, Policy 70 was put on hold, mainly due to Brexit and the move of the EMA, and we are yet to receive word when Policy 70 will be reinstated. In the second phase of Policy 70, the intent is to make available individual patient data or data listings, anonymized, and make them available in conjunction with the clinical trial documents for submission. The timing of this is to be determined. There's a lot more sensitivity around releasing the actual data than the documents, and anonymization, excuse me, and ensuring the risk of re-identification of individual patients is really minimized while maintaining the utility of the data is critical. So on the right-hand side here, Fuse came out with some recommendations for the EMA policy restart. Recommendations, because there's been, I mean, it's been a couple of years, right? There's a backlog of MAAs and type 2 variation submissions. So how to deal with that? Fuse recommends starting with new submissions, those due in 2020. Packages already submitted to Health Canada, if there is an acknowledgement and agreement that those are fit for use and can be repurposed. And then looking at the backlog, looking at the earliest MAAs, and so on and so forth. Hopefully we're all familiar with the CTD Triangle. This just lays out, what is in scope for Policy 70. The Module 2 documents, including clinical overview as well as summary documents, and then the Module 5 documents, the CSRs, protocols, narratives, SAPs, CRFs are all included. This is a lot of information. It can be hundreds of thousands of pages per submission. Scope of phase 2, as I said, release of individual patient data, but also the requirement to generate layperson or plain language summaries and disseminate these back to the patients who participated in the clinical trials. That is to be implemented at a later date in conjunction with the rollout of the new database, which is slated for the end of 2021 or early 2022. When Policy 70 was being rolled out, the use of the clinical documents that were posted to the EMA clinical data sharing website was of great concern, but that sort of went away. So I wanted to revisit it here briefly. The user agreement for use of these documents, which you have to agree to by checking a box, indicates that the user can use the clinical reports for academic and non-commercial research purposes. Users not granted any intellectual property or commercial rights to any of the documents or materials. The user may not use the clinical reports to support an application or marketing authorization, share the user's name, password, or account details, make any unfair commercial use of the clinical reports, or most importantly, I think, seek to re-identify the trial subjects or other individuals from the clinical reports. Having said all that, there is a use agreement for the documents, but the EMA has stated that they will not enforce the terms of use of data and documents. So it is up to the user and the viewer of the documents to follow the use agreement and use their discretion. So implementation of Policy 70 is very complex, has many moving parts, requires very specific knowledge of applicable laws, regulations, and guidance, requires specific skill sets, an understanding of the clinical trial, clinical development, and product submission life cycles, and really importantly, excuse me, it requires engagement and partnership across the entire organization, not just clinical development. This is one of the few activities and functions that really interacts and engages with all parts of the organization, from corporate legal to clinical operations, medical writing, biostats, CMC, PK/PD, so on and so forth. I've just put a few of them here for examples. So that's a brief overview of Policy 70. Wanted to keep that brief because hopefully most of us are familiar with it. I'm going to hand off to Kavita, who's going to talk about Health Canada PRCI.
Hi, this is Kavita Verma. I will go over the requirements of Health Canada's public release of clinical information, commonly known as PRCI, and the differences between Health Canada's PRCI and Policy 70 today. PRCI came into force in Feb 2019. Since then, over 60 redacted packages have been published on Health Canada's clinical trial information platform. We have had an opportunity to work on many retrospective and prospective submissions. A few more are lined up for this year. The main objective of this initiative is to make anonymized clinical information in drug submissions and medical device applications publicly available following approval or negative decision. This in turn enables independent reanalysis of data, foster new research questions, and benefit people by helping them to make informed decisions about their health. What's in scope of proposed regulations? It is applicable to both drug and device, basically the safety and efficacy information related to completed clinical trials that supports the proposed indication of use is in scope of Health Canada's PRCI. In general, information ceases to be confidential business information following final regulatory decision and authorizes Health Canada to publicly release this information. PRCI applies to clinical trial information in past submission as well as new submissions. Next slide, please. Let's talk about the phased implementation. Both Health Canada and EMA has implemented a phased approach. PRCI will be phased in over 4 years. In this year, that is 2020, publication applies to clinical trial information within all new drug submissions, including both NDS and those categorized as new active substance. Supplemental new drug submissions containing confirmatory trials, and RX switch, that is submissions to switch an authorized medicinal ingredient to non-prescription status. Yes, and EMA will be phased out in 2 phases. EMA's phase 1 concerns the publication of clinical reports submitted to the authority regardless of the outcome of the regulatory procedure. It entered into force in 2015 and it applies to new product approval, new indication, line extension application, and Article 58 applications. EMA's phase 2 concerns the publication of individual patient data. At this point, all we know is EMA will implement this phase at a later stage. Let's look at some of the high-level differences between Health Canada's PRCI and Policy 70 on the slide. These certainly impact the strategy to approach anonymization, especially when the submissions are planned in multiple regions with different timelines. Clinical information from past submissions can be requested under PRCI through Health Canada's Clinical Information Portal, whereas in the EMA, past submissions are not covered under Policy 70. It can be requested under a different policy, that is Policy 43. PRCI applies to drug and device, whereas Policy 70 applies to drug only. Individual patient data is not in scope of PRCI but planned for phase 2 of Policy 70. Health Canada will accept anonymized or redacted documents of a drug submission that was previously accepted by EMA Policy 70. But in this case, a signed certification letter that attests identical clinical information published under EMA Policy 70 must be submitted. Quality and non-clinical information is considered confidential business information by Health Canada if it meets the definition, whereas it is not considered as confidential information by EMA, except some of which that may potentially be confidential CCI with strong justification. Health Canada has the final veto power on what can be redacted, whereas sponsor makes the final decision under EMA Policy 70. That being said, a situation may arise where an agreement between sponsor and EMA was not reached on the proposed redaction. In this case, the sponsor can apply for interim relief against an EMA decision to publish the documents without accepting the redactions which are still controversial. The interim relief is filed with the General Code of the European Union. While the decision is outstanding, EMA will publish a partial final redacted version of the clinical reports. When a final decision on the interim relief proceedings is issued, the sponsor shall submit a final redacted version in accordance with the court's verdict. EMA will withdraw from its corporate website the partial final redacted version previously published and publish the final redacted version. Let's look at a few more differences here. The type of redaction display is not specified by Health Canada, but EMA mandates use of appropriate labels to redact protected personal data and confidential information. In our experience, Health Canada has accepted EMA's requirement for overlay code if explained in the anonymization report. Both authorities encourage anonymization over redaction and recommend sponsors to retain the scientific usefulness of the data that would benefit the public while achieving adequate anonymization. In general, the ICH CTD Module 2.5, that is Clinical Overview, Module 271 to 274, Clinical Summary, and Module 5.3, Clinical Study Report, including Protocol, Statistical Analysis Plan, and Sample Case Report form are published along with the anonymization report in both cases, PRCI as well as Policy 70. Individual patient data listings within the CSR body of the report, such as abnormal laboratory value listings, which are commonly found in section 14.3.4, are considered as out of scope of phase 1 of EMA Policy 70 and can be removed, but are considered to be in scope of Health Canada PRCI, and sponsors are allowed to anonymize direct and indirect identifiers. In general, for both agencies, the proposed and the final redacted packages should be submitted to e-submission gateway. In terms of the retrospective request, where paper submissions are were involved, Health Canada acknowledges the burden on the sponsor and allows submission of redacted packages via other agreed upon methods such as Box, SharePoint. Basically, sponsors can save some document processing time in the gateway. The transparency process is more or less similar, but the timeline differs. The overall process comprises of 5 steps, starting with process initiation by health authority, submission of redacted proposal by the sponsor, authority review and consultation process, submission of final redacted document, and finally health authority publishes the redacted version. Health Canada's process is initiated on the date of final regulatory decision, whereas EMA process is initiated upon CHMP opinion or post receipt of withdrawal letter by EMA. If you look at the overall timeline on the slide, Health Canada has a stricter timeline of 120 days. The timeline for the second round of review and finalization of the redacted package is tricky to achieve. It is advisable to take advantage of the process initiation meeting to discuss the scope of the documents, clarify requirements, and possibly discuss the anonymization strategy and proposed confidential business information. This will reduce the burden at the later stage of revising and submitting final redacted package. On the other hand, the EMA has a structured consultation process of about 50 days, which begins after the submission of redaction proposal package. It gives the sponsor some time to discuss and attain agreement on the anonymization report with the EMA, and yes, of course, the sponsor can apply for interim relief. With this, I would like to hand over to Megan, who will walk you through the additional avenues for data sharing and future of transparency.
Thanks, Kavita. Hi, everyone. I'm Megan Niner, and I'm going to be walking you through the next 2 sections. So we're going to start here with additional avenues for sharing clinical trial documents. This slide in particular is going to focus on clinical data sharing prior to product approval. So there's increasing requirements from journals to publish or to submit protocols and statistical analysis plans for studies and have them posted at the same time that the manuscript is to be posted. Clinical trial registries, there are a few registries currently where documents are required to be posted. For the USA, we have clinicaltrials.gov, and with the effect of the final rule, redacted protocols and statistical analysis plans are required at the time of results disclosure for applicable clinical trials with primary completion dates on or after the Sorry about that. I'm not sure what happened, but so I will just restart that little section. So with clinical trial registries, different countries have their own. In the USA, we have clinicaltrials.gov. With the effect of the final rule, redacted protocols and statistical analysis plans are required to be posted and disclosed for applicable clinical trials with primary completion dates on or after the 18th of January 2017. Germany has a registry at pharmanet.bund, and this one mandates the submission of the CSR synopsis within 6 months of marketing authorization or within 12 months after the end of trial conducted with the approved products. In Spain, there's the REEC, and this requires summary results like the CSR synopsis or a copy of the published UDRA-CT results summary to be submitted to the ECM portal to Health Authority within 12 months for adult trials and 6 months for pediatric trials. In the Netherlands, they have CCMO, and this requires summary results to be published no later than 12 years after the end of the study. Please note that our list here is not exhaustive. Then for things coming down the pipeline here, we have for EMA clinical trial regulation, CTIS has a proposed go live date planned for next December, or not next December, but December of 2021. And this regulation will make that documents and data held in the EU clinical trial database will also be subject to disclosure rules set out in this new regulation. Additionally, they're going to roll out UDAMED in May of 2022, or at least that's the proposed date right now. And this is another database that will help provide a public posting area for improving transparency through the establishment of a comprehensive EU database on medical devices. So considering the varied timelines to disclose these documents through these different avenues, sponsors really need to try to align their redaction strategies to be able to repurpose information for most of their data transparency deliverables. Next slide, please. So this slide, we are now going to move on to looking at clinical data sharing following the health authority product approval. And so we talked a lot about Health Canada and EU already, and there are other countries as well that have product approval after product approval clinical data sharing. So in Japan, the public disclosure of information on new drug development came into effect in 2013. This requirement includes the publication of modules 1 and 2 from new drug applications to be posted since the start of that year. In many companies, there are Freedom of Information Acts, and this globally allows the public the right to request access to records from any federal agency. And these agencies are then required to disclose any information requested under the Freedom of Information Act, unless it falls under an exemption which protects interests such as personal privacy, national security, and law enforcement. Next up, there are additional EU country data transparency requirements. Our example here is Ukraine, where they have laws on medicines in recent, excuse me, they have the laws on medicines, which introduces the obligation for their Ministry of Health to publish preclinical studies and clinical trial reports applicable, and this is applicable for any registrations after the 2nd of August 2019. And these are posted on their official website. But right now there's a lot of ambiguity around the legislation and the requirements. Okay. Next up, there can be summary information published on regulatory websites as part of drug approval processes. So for example, in the US, the FDA approval package or the FDA Advisory Committee briefing materials are posted, Health Canada's regulatory decision summaries are posted, and the European Public Assessment records, and plenty of others. Next up, there are pharma industry associations that have some rules. There's was a joint position on the disclosure of clinical trial information via clinical trial registries and databases. This was issued on the 6th of January 2005 as a joint communication by 4 organizations, four organizations that were the International Federation of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Associations, the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America, the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industry Associations, and the Japan Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association. This communication declared that registration for all clinical trials except for exploratory studies must be disclosed, and information on the results of all studies except for the mentioned exploratory studies on drugs approved or marketed in at least one foreign country must be disclosed. Additionally, there are numerous clinical study data request platforms that allow researchers to request clinical data. Some of these are individual sponsor sites, and others are collaborations with multiple sponsors. And finally, there's the EU PASS register. And for non-interventional PASS studies, the study protocol should be uploaded as soon as possible after its finalization and prior to the start of data collection. And the redacted results abstract, or the CSR synopsis, is required to be posted within 12 months from the end of data collection. It's also recommended that other PASS studies are registered for increased transparency. Next slide, please. So now we're going to be looking at what the future holds for clinical data and document sharing. So as we've mentioned a little bit, there's phase 2 of EMA Policy 70 coming out, and this will bring IPD sharing along with plain language and lay summaries. Outside of this, there will be more streaming of data, and this will lead to an increase of data sharing policies around the globe. And this will also cause the potential of a significant increase in the number of requests for data. All this together means that companies will need to take the following considerations for the future of anonymization. In particular, they'll need to look at risk-based approaches, plausible re-identification attacks, and data utility considerations. The bottom line of all this is that more data means more complexity. And more complexity means a larger need for reliance on specialized solutions, including tools that provide the full benefits of automation and enter once, use everywhere methodology. Next slide, please. So with this influx of data from so many sources, we have to ask, is this getting to be too much information? And is it appropriate? Will patients and caregivers who have a vested interest in the research be able to find, navigate, organize, understand, and make sense of all this information? And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Kelly again.
Thanks, Megan, and thanks, Kavita, for that overview. As I said, we can't dig into the details here in the limited time that we have, but what are we looking at next? So transparency regulations and recommendations around the globe are increasing. This definitely is a sign that this area is becoming an area of focus and importance, and is globally understood and recognized to be important, and is becoming accepted. While disclosure and transparency activities have historically been a subset embedded within clinical development, the focus has primarily been on compliance. This is changing. We're growing, we're evolving, and disclosure and transparency as a function and the activities associated with it are becoming a critical pathway for providing important clinical information to the public and researchers. You can think of clinical trial disclosure and data transparency as evolving and growing into what is becoming a sort of gatekeeper function for sponsors. We coordinate clinical data and information release for products under development. We put a lot of effort into ensuring consistency of data and information release across the myriad of use cases. The example I can think of is clinical trial protocol is released in at multiple points in the clinical trial and clinical development lifecycle. How do you ensure consistency in the way that that document has either been redacted and or anonymized? And we help to ensure that the information released is appropriate for the audience that it's intended for. This will become increasingly important as plain language or lay summaries come into effect. And we help facilitate and ensure that that information, that data, is reaching its intended audience. Doing this all while maintaining the privacy of trial participants, the integrity of the clinical trials, and the protection of intellectual property. I cannot overstate that enough. That is a critical component of what we do on a day-to-day basis, is ensuring the confidentiality and privacy of patients is maintained, and IP and company confidential information is not released, and clinical trials aren't compromised in any way. It's increasingly important. Finally then, the enhanced focus and growing acceptance of transparency is good news. I think everyone will agree. But the often disjointed and poorly aligned policies create challenges for sponsors who are struggling not just to keep up with the new requirements, but to create processes that meet and account for all the regulations. Creating global transparency strategies and implementing tools and systems to enable and automate disclosure and transparency activities requires significant knowledge, expertise of applicable regulations, as well as the clinical trial and global submission environment. Enhancing responsible data sharing by effective tools like our TrialAssure suite of transparency applications can help ensure compliance, but also speed research, speed collaboration, and speed access to new therapies. We at MMS take pride in being able to share our knowledge and experience with our sponsors. We've seen what works and what doesn't. We were involved in the very first EMA Policy 70 package, and we've done numerous since. We were involved in some of the very first Health Canada PRCI packages and have been involved in numerous retrospective as well as prospective. We know what works and what doesn't. And we found that sponsors value our experience and the knowledge that we can bring to the table in helping them navigate the challenging transparency landscape. And even beyond that, helping partner sponsors really think about transparency holistically and help develop strategies, infrastructure, governance, processes to help manage this very complex and dynamic space that we're living in today. That's only going to grow more complex and have more and more requirements over time. So with that, we have approximately 15 minutes left for any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much, Kelly. I really appreciate that. And thank you, Kavita and Megan, as well for your insights. As Kelly mentioned, we would like to move on to the Q&A portion of this webinar. We did receive a few questions throughout. Kelly, this first question is for you. It says, what are health authorities such as EMA and Health Canada doing to support global harmonization to have one approach for redaction tagging, such as PI versus PPD?
It's a very good question, and one that we didn't specifically call out in the presentation, but you will have noticed that the definitions for different categories of confidential information between the EMA and Health Canada are slightly different, subtly different, essentially meaning the same thing, but have different nomenclature. So PPI, personal protected information, or personal private information for the EMA versus PI, private information in Canada. The nomenclature may not be aligned. However, there is an acknowledgement, at least from Health Canada, of packages that have been submitted and posted by the EMA for Policy 70, and Health Canada will recognize and will accept those packages with rationale. We actually are not sure at this point whether the reciprocal will be true. We hope and we presume that it will, that anything that has been submitted while Policy 70 has been on hold to Health Canada under PRCI would ideally be accepted by EMA under Policy 70, again, with rationale, but we don't know for sure. It remains to be seen. So to answer your question, I think that that's going to be a struggle, as more and more countries and regions and regulatory authorities implement and institute policies similar to PRCI and Policy 70, it's going to become increasingly important to ensure that there is recognition and consistency in the way that these regulations are implemented.
Thank you, Kelly. And this next question is from Megan. For the PMDA data sharing requirement, you mentioned modules 1 and 2 will be made public. Is this in English or Japanese? And can sponsors redact these documents, or are these made available by PMDA automatically following the NDA approval?
So I do know that on their website, PDMA has it that it has to be in Japanese. So that does add an extra hurdle to publishing there. I do not know the answer to about redacting the documents.
I can take that one.
Thanks, Kavita.
Okay. The sponsor, I believe, can propose redactions, which is then published by PDMA after NDA approval. And I also fairly know that the final call on what has to be redacted, be it personal information or confidential information, is taken by PDNE.
I'll just make a comment on that as well, and it's more of a general comment that this is a really, really important point and speaks to ensuring that there is consistency in the way that you are either redacting or anonymizing and or both documents for release to the regulatory authorities and ultimately to the public. There are situations, I've been involved in situations where an authorized agent on behalf of a sponsor, for example, a CRO working in a specific country, has released information to the regulatory authority and has not redacted that information. It was an inadvertent release, innocent, but at the end of the day, the regulatory authority did post that information publicly to the website, and as a result, that information was not able to be redacted in either a Policy 70, PRCI, or FOI subsequent request because it's already in the public domain. So ensuring consistency is critical in terms of development of your overall strategy and governance and how you're approaching transparency holistically.
Thank you, Kelly, and thanks, Kavita and Megan, for answering that question. Kavita, I have the next question for you. Does Health Canada allow companies to submit both redaction proposal and final redacted package outside of the gateway?
Yeah, this is a good question. For paper submissions, not for prospective submissions, for paper submissions done in the past, Health Canada recognizes the burden on sponsors and allows submission of both the redaction proposal package and the final package via other agreed means outside of gateway like Box or SharePoint.
Wonderful.
And keep in mind, this is Kelly again, keep in mind that the cycle time, turnaround time, especially once comments are received from Health Canada, is very, very tight and can be very challenging for sponsors, particularly on large packages, large applications with multiple documents, thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of pages. You know, having 5 days to turn around comments as opposed to I believe it's the 60-day turnaround time for EMA Policy 70 is a significant challenge. And as Kavita mentioned during her overview, planning for that up front and minimizing the number of comments coming back from Health Canada is critical to ensuring that you're able to meet that time requirement.
Okay, great. And Kelly, this last question is for you. Do you think that a globally harmonized rule set for sharing data will ever be implemented?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, you know, I liken it to clinical data management. I started my career in data management and managed data management organizations, developed EDC systems, and we were always looking for a single standard. CDISC was conceived in and around 1998, I believe, for this purpose, and have made great strides to standardizing and harmonizing clinical data standards. Will the same happen for clinical trial disclosure and data transparency activities and data and information that's released to the public? I think it's going to be some time in the future before that happens. We already see right now that clinicaltrials.gov has different requirements than UDRA-CT, the EU registry, the current EU registry, particularly in terms of results summary postings. And there is some reuse of information across registries, but at this point it is minimal. And do I see that being harmonized anytime soon? Not in the very near future. I think it's something that is going to happen, in maybe 5 years. I think that there's so many new regulations coming on board so quickly that the industry as a whole is scrambling to keep up with the regulations and requirements. And this will come after we come to a somewhat stable environment in this space.
Thank you, Kelly. And thank you, Megan and Kavita as well. To all the attendees, for additional free webinars, just visit mmsholdings.com/webinars. As Kelly mentioned, our next webinar on transparency will be August 20th, so we hope you all can join us. If you have any additional questions on what you heard today, please follow up with your point of contact at MMS or Trilisure, or email media@mmsholdings.com directly, just as it's shown on the screen, and we'll direct you to one of the presenters. Thank you so much for listening today, and enjoy your day.